In this episode, we're going to practice one of the most valuable governance skills you can develop as a beginner: interpreting major standards and programs without claiming they require more than they actually do. The Certified in Governance, Risk, and Compliance (CGRC) mindset is built on defensible reasoning, and defensible reasoning depends on staying inside scope, staying inside authority, and staying inside what the requirement driver truly demands. Beginners often hear names like ISO/IEC, FedRAMP, PCI DSS, and CMMC and assume they are all the same kind of thing, or they assume that if one program is strict, then the strictest interpretation must always be the safest. That instinct leads to overreach, which is where you apply requirements to the wrong systems, demand controls that are not actually required, or claim compliance benefits you cannot prove. Overreach creates waste, frustration, and credibility loss because teams begin to treat compliance as arbitrary. The goal here is to give you a calm way to interpret these frameworks and programs by asking what they are, what they apply to, what level they operate at, and what evidence they are really asking you to produce. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A first step is understanding that these names represent different kinds of instruments in the governance world, even though they all relate to security and compliance. ISO/IEC often refers to international standards that can define management system requirements and best practices for information security and risk management across many organizations. FedRAMP is a U.S. government program focused on authorizing cloud services for government use, which creates standardized security assessment and authorization expectations for cloud service offerings. Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, is a standard focused specifically on protecting payment card data, and it applies to organizations that store, process, or transmit that data. Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, is a program associated with defense contracting expectations, emphasizing maturity and implementation of security requirements for organizations that handle certain types of sensitive government-related information. These are not interchangeable, and treating them as interchangeable is the first path to confusion. Each has its own scope triggers, evidence expectations, and typical stakeholders. An interpretation starts by recognizing what category of requirement you are dealing with. When you keep the category clear, you stop expecting one to answer the same question another one answers. Overreach often comes from ignoring applicability. So let's make applicability the next anchor concept. Applicability answers why a standard or program is relevant to your organization and which parts of your environment it actually touches. For PCI DSS, applicability is triggered by payment card data, meaning it focuses on the cardholder data environment and systems connected to it in ways that matter. For FedRAMP, applicability is tied to cloud services being offered to U.S. federal agencies or to environments that require FedRAMP authorization as part of procurement. For CMMC, applicability is driven by defense contracting requirements and the presence of controlled unclassified information or other sensitive data types defined by contract and policy. For ISO/IEC standards, applicability can be chosen voluntarily for program maturity and assurance, or it can be required by customers or contracts, and it often applies to the management system scope the organization defines. The key is that none of these should be applied to everything by default unless there is a clear driver. A mature CGRC approach defines the in-scope boundary for each and then interprets requirements within that boundary. That prevents both hidden scope and unnecessary expansion, which is the heart of avoiding overreach. Now let's talk about ISO/IEC in a beginner-friendly way that emphasizes interpretation rather than document trivia. Many people associate ISO/IEC with a management system approach, where an organization defines a structured program for information security, including policy, roles, risk assessment, control selection, and continual improvement. The key interpretation habit with management system standards is to look for requirements about process and governance. not just technical controls. These standards often care that you have a systematic way to decide what controls you need, that you implement them, and that you monitor and improve with documented evidence. Overreach happens when someone treats an ISO/IEC approach as a fixed checklist that must be implemented identically in every organization, because the management system concept expects tailoring based on risk and context. Another form of overreach is claiming certification or compliance without understanding what the scope of the management system actually covers. If the organization's defined scope is a subset of systems and processes, you cannot honestly claim the whole organization is covered. The mature approach is to interpret ISO/IEC as a framework for building and operating a security management system, with careful attention to scope statements, risk-driven control selection, and evidence of continual improvement. That keeps you aligned with the intent and prevents inflated claims. FedRAMP requires a different interpretation mindset because it is a structured authorization program with formal assessment expectations. For beginners, the key is to think of FedRAMP as a standardized approach to assessing and authorizing cloud service offerings for government use, with defined baselines and documentation and continuous monitoring expectations. The interpretation trap is to treat FedRAMP as a generic security framework you can apply casually to any system, because FedRAMP is designed around cloud service offerings and a specific authorization process. Overreach can show up as applying FedRAMP requirements to systems that are not in the FedRAMP boundary, or claiming a FedRAMP status that does not exist for a particular offering. Another overreach risk is confusing the responsibilities between the cloud service provider and the cloud customer, because in many cloud contexts, responsibilities are shared and must be clearly documented. A mature interpretation begins by defining what the service offering is, what boundary is being assessed, and what controls are implemented by the provider versus expected of the customer. It also emphasizes documentation and evidence as core artifacts, because authorization decisions depend on demonstrable implementation and monitoring. When you interpret FedRAMP through its purpose and boundary, you can discuss it accurately without turning it into a vague catch-all. PCI DSS is often easier for beginners to grasp because it is tied to a specific type of data and a specific type of business activity, but it still produces overreach when scope is misunderstood. PCI DSS is focused on protecting cardholder data and related sensitive authentication data, and it applies to environments where that data is stored, processed, or transmitted. The key interpretation skill is scoping the cardholder data environment, because scope determines what must meet the standards requirements and what evidence must be produced. Overreach can happen in two directions here: expanding scope unnecessarily, so the entire organization is treated like it handles card data, which increases cost and complexity, or shrinking scope improperly so systems that connect to cardholder data are excluded, which creates risk and can lead to noncompliance. A mature approach defines the data flow, identifies the systems that touch that flow, identifies connected systems that could impact security, and then applies controls and evidence expectations within that defined boundary. Another interpretation trap is treating PCI DSS as equivalent to full enterprise security maturity, because PCI DSS is targeted, and an organization can be compliant in that environment while still having weaknesses elsewhere. Avoiding overreach means you respect what the standard covers and do not claim it solves everything. It also means you treat evidence and ongoing maintenance as essential, because compliance is not a one-time event. CMMC introduces a different dimension because it is often described in terms of maturity and implementation, and it is tied to specific contracting expectations. A beginner-friendly interpretation is that CMMC is meant to create consistent expectations for cybersecurity practices in the defense industrial base, with requirements that depend on the level and the type of information handled. The key interpretation skill is understanding that the program is driven by contract requirements and the handling of certain sensitive information types, which means applicability and scope are defined by what work you do and what data you touch. Overreach can occur when an organization assumes it must implement the highest level everywhere without confirming what is actually required for its contracts, which wastes effort and creates unnecessary friction. Overreach can also occur when an organization claims maturity or certification status without having the required evidence or assessment context. A mature approach interprets CMMC by first confirming which level is relevant to the organization's work, then defining the scope boundary where the relevant information is handled, then designing controls and evidence practices that demonstrate required practices are implemented. Because maturity implies consistency, the program also expects repeatable, institutionalized processes rather than one-off fixes. Interpreting CMMC without overreach means you treat it as a structured expectation tied to specific drivers, not as a vague label you apply to everything. Now let's focus on what these programs and standards have in common, because common structure helps you interpret them consistently. All of them rely on a clear scope boundary, defined responsibilities, implemented controls, and evidence. All of them can fail if documentation is vague or if controls are not maintained over time. All of them can be misrepresented if someone claims they apply to systems or processes outside the defined boundary. They also all intersect with risk management, because even when requirements are mandatory, organizations still make risk decisions about how to implement controls and how to handle exceptions. The common interpretation move is to ask, what is the driver? What is the boundary? What controls are expected? What evidence is required? And what does ongoing maintenance look like? When you apply those questions, you prevent overreach because you stop yourself from assuming requirements apply universally. You also prevent underreach because you are forced to identify connected systems and shared responsibility areas that could affect compliance. This consistent questioning is a hallmark of mature CGRC thinking because it produces defensible, repeatable interpretation. A key danger in interpretation is mixing levels, meaning you answer a governance question with a control checklist, or you answer a control requirement question with a broad management system statement. For example, if a scenario is asking what a management system standard expects, a correct answer may emphasize risk-driven control selection and continual improvement rather than listing specific technical safeguards. If a scenario is asking about a targeted standard like PCI DSS, a correct answer may emphasize scoping the environment and applying specific protective practices within it rather than talking only about enterprise governance values. Overreach often happens when you pick the strictest sounding answer without matching it to the question's level and boundary. The exam tends to punish this because it rewards appropriateness, not maximum intensity. A mature approach is to match the response to the requirement driver and the scope boundary described. That is also how real compliance programs work, because different standards require different types of artifacts and different types of assurance. When you keep level alignment, your interpretation stays accurate and credible. Vendor and shared responsibility issues also create overreach risk, especially with programs like FedRAMP and with scope standards like PCI DSS, because organizations may assume someone else is handling controls. A mature interpretation recognizes that compliance obligations can be shared, but accountability remains, meaning you must know who is responsible for which control and what evidence proves it. For example, a provider may implement certain safeguards, but the customer may still be responsible for identity management decisions, access approvals, and data handling behaviors. Overreach occurs when an organization claims compliance based on a vendor's claims without understanding what is actually covered by the vendor's assurance. Underreach occurs when an organization assumes vendor responsibility means no oversight is needed, which is rarely true. The CGRC habit is to define boundaries and responsibilities explicitly, then collect appropriate evidence at the right level. This also helps you communicate honestly, because you can state what is covered and what is not, which builds trust with auditors, customers, and leadership. Clear shared responsibility thinking prevents the program from becoming a set of assumptions. As we close, interpreting ISO/IEC, FedRAMP, PCI DSS, and CMMC without overreach is about discipline in scope, authority, and claims. Each one is a different kind of instrument with different triggers for applicability and different expectations for evidence and ongoing operation. ISO/IEC often emphasizes management system structure, risk-driven control selection, and continual improvement within a defined scope. FedRAMP emphasizes authorization of cloud service offerings with formal assessment artifacts and continuous monitoring within a defined boundary. PCI DSS emphasizes protection of payment card data within a carefully scoped cardholder data environment and connected systems that matter. CMMC emphasizes required practices and maturity expectations driven by defense, contracting context, and sensitive information handling within defined boundaries. The common CGRC skill is asking what is driving the requirement, what is in scope, who is responsible for what controls and evidence are expected, and how the program stays alive over time. When you use that skill, you avoid both wasting effort on unnecessary expansion and undermining trust through inflated claims. That is the kind of careful, defensible thinking governance programs depend on, and it is exactly what strong exam answers tend to reflect.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.